Welcome back to the Discover podcast, where we view faith as a discovery journey with Jesus to help you become the person God created you to be. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Discover podcast. This week, we are continuing our section of this first season, talking with different counselors, therapists, and spiritual directors. And today I'm sitting down with a great friend, Jenny Heckman, who's been here and taught here and preached here before. She's been a part of the Meadowbrook Church. She's currently on staff at Northbrook Church. And so today we are jumping in to the heavy theme of shame. She is going to help kind of navigate the different types of shame that we might experience, and then help us understand how we might find ourselves experiencing freedom from the shame that we carry. So if you're in a place of just thinking like, man, I'm not good enough for anything, there's no way that I'll ever amount to anything, I think you're really going to appreciate what she has to share. Twice now, because with Tyler and with Heather, this is like kind of like a mother's room on Sunday, and we had this toy over there. So like I get started like, hey, welcome back, and then this like random toy just starts making noise out of nowhere. So
the best.
Hey, welcome back to the Discover podcast. I'm sitting here with my friend Jenny Heckman, and so glad to have you here today. We're going to be talking about a variety of things, but really focusing on the theme of shame. But before we get going, why don't you take a minute and just introduce yourself to everybody?
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be here. I am, first and foremost, married to Mark for almost 35 years. I'm a mom of 4 children. 2 daughters, 2 sons, ranging in age from 30 down to 25, and a grandmother of baby Archie, who is 10 months old.
Nice.
Professionally, I serve as a pastor at Northbrook Church as pastoral care and counseling pastor. I was at Meadowbrook and a couple other churches for a long period of time. Prior to that, took about a 10-year break. And opened a private counseling practice. I also have a master's degree in counseling and a license in the state of Wisconsin, and have a private counseling practice that I do part-time.
Nice. So you have a pretty wide range of experience there in what you just listed. It sounds like it was church work, it was counseling work, and now it's a combination of church and counseling. So maybe just give us a little context to the journey of kind of how you went from, I don't know if you were necessarily a pastor or doing like pastoral ministry at Meadowbrook, but what was the journey from there to counseling, back to pastoral work, and keeping that counseling work going?
Well, the journey started actually before I came to Meadowbrook, which I think people might be interested to hear this part because it will make sense of the story and the context. But when I went to college, I graduated from the University of Wisconsin at Madison with a degree in rehabilitation psychology. And my goal was I wanted to work in the city of Milwaukee, working with the chronically mentally ill, and then gradually work through my master's degree and continue that work and also open a private practice.
So that was back in undergrad years.
That was undergrad years.
Interesting. Okay.
So the summer between my junior and senior year at Wisconsin, I got a call from the then pastor of pastoral counseling at Meadowbrook, mentioning to me that he had a full-time summer internship available, paid. Oh. Would I be interested in coming on for a summer? And for me, it was wonderful. It was full-time paid work, and the university gave me 6 internship credits for it.
Even better.
But it was during that summer that my whole career path changed. And that was because my heart about working with the chronically mentally ill were to be able to work with the people that were what I considered to be the most unreached, underserved. And when I was in the context of the church for that summer, what I realized very quickly, and it's very, very different now than it was then, but the people in the church were some of the most unreached people in terms of mental health. And so from there, I went and I graduated from Wisconsin, and Meadowbrook hired me on as a resident and then as a ministry assistant and eventually as a pastor. And I stayed there until 2007. So I was there from 1989 in some way, shape, or form until 2007.
Wow.
Yep.
So did you grow up in the Milwaukee area then?
I did. Grew up in Waukesha.
Oh, wow. And so were you were you going to did you have a connection to Elmbrook before that internship?
Yes, my whole family came to faith when I was a middle schooler, and Elmbrook was the first church that we went to as a family of faith. So that was my home church. Went to the youth groups there, college age ministry.
Nice.
The whole bit. Got married there.
Yeah. So you went into undergrad not anticipating to work at a church. It was always
it was not on my radar.
I'm going to do more clinical work as a counselor and a therapist. So then how did you make the decision to go from pastoral work to open your own practice?
Well, while I was at Elmbrook, I knew that I wanted to get an advanced degree. I just wasn't sure if I wanted to go back and get an MDiv or if I wanted to get a master's in counseling. But what I decided was that I wanted something that would be, first of all, very practical in the work that I did. And at that time, MDivs, they offered very little, both content and curriculum as well as hands-on with the people part of pastoral care.
Yeah, I think I had like one class.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I opted to go get my master's degree while I was at Elmbrook from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, which was an excellent program, and it still is. But at that point, I decided that I really wanted to stay in the context of the church, doing what I was doing. But then I had just kind of a little bit of, I don't know how to describe it, maybe just a sense like the walls of the church were just getting a little bit too small. And decided that I wanted to use my master's degree to open a private practice. So I applied for my training license, got my hours, found a clinical supervisor, did all my 3,000 hours, got licensed, and then at that point opened up a full-time private counseling practice.
Right. Wow. And now you do both. You have your own practice and you're back pastoring again. So what was the decision to say, hey, I'm going to go now work in the church again?
Well, honestly, the decision was, quite frankly, my therapist.
Oh.
And
as a therapist, you have your own
absolutely. I don't know that anybody should be in the therapist chair if they don't have their own therapist, Brian. But I was lamenting to her that I felt very much like an imposter and a fraud as a clinical therapist, because so much of what I was doing didn't feel all that clinical.
Yeah.
It was, to some degree, but I also wove in a lot of the pastoral care and counseling and some spiritual direction as well into the work that I did. And during one of our sessions, she said something to me that completely reframed how I looked at my work. And that was, Jenny, I think you're going to do better work if you see yourself as a pastor cleverly disguised as a therapist. And so it just gave me a lot of freedom, honestly, spiritually and psychologically, to practice the way I sensed God was asking me to practice. And then I started having a relationship with Northbrook.
Yeah.
I was doing speaking there. I was doing some staff development and training. The position that I'm now in was open for about a year before I started having conversations with their leadership about me filling that role.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how it is. And I just feel like this is really the last big stage of my career.
Yeah.
And it's just really a gift to be able to do formal ministry within the context of the church as well as in my clinical practice.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you for all that context. And part of that was, I was just curious because I don't know if I've actually ever heard the story kind of go from one chapter to the next. So with that context, I mentioned we are going to talk about specifically shame. So we're in this stretch of this season that we're in with our podcast that as we're winding down the first season, we thought, hey, let's talk to some therapists, counselors, and spiritual directors about this idea of story development, meaning our own personal story. So we've had about 15 episodes of people sharing their own story and their spiritual journey. And I think we would all say at some point, everybody's story is broken. Everybody's story is has hurt and loss and guilt. And it's just that all of our stories are messy in some capacity. And oftentimes we look to therapists as people who can help people walk a path towards healing and wholeness. And when we asked you, hey, what would you want to talk about today? Your first response was shame. And so share a little bit why, after hearing 15 episodes of stories of like just people's spiritual journey, why shame came to mind to you as like, oh, this would be helpful to talk about.
when I heard what you had been doing in terms of the storytelling and the stories of hope and redemption, one of the first things that came to my mind about shame is that shame has a tremendous ability to rewrite our stories with the wrong narrative. And that's why I think it's worth talking about, identifying, and unpacking.
Yeah. So say more about that in terms of what do you mean when shame can rewrite our story?
Well, there's a certain type of shame, which we'll get to in a second, I'm sure, in the conversation. But there's a certain type of shame that tells us it's a deceiver. It tells us lies about ourselves, about our place in the world, our purpose. And it oftentimes becomes then the lens through which we see. The lens through which we see ourselves, the other, God. And also it becomes the lens through which we make decisions about how we're going to be interacting with the world, ourselves, the other, and God. So how we see, but also how we interact and behave.
And maybe it'd be helpful for us to start with like a working definition of what shame is. So how would you define shame?
Yes. Well, I tell people all the time, doesn't matter if I'm preaching or doing something like this, that the majority of good information I have to give you has been passed on to me from people smarter and wiser than myself. Okay, so I'm going to give credit where credit is due. There is a book, you can still get it on Amazon. It's called Overcoming Guilt and Shame.
Okay, there we go.
By Dr. Dan Green and Dr. Mel Lorenz.
Okay.
And in this book, I think to date, I have not read a better description of shame, because not all shame is the same.
Okay.
So can I just give you like a little bit of working definition?
Please.
Okay. So they identify 3 types of shame. Because, by the way, we think all shame is bad.
Right.
But actually, we need to have some shame or we would all be psychopaths, you know?
Right.
So there's a type of shame that they call moral shame.
Okay.
And that they call the tutor. And that is the kind of shame, I can't remember where it is in the New Testament, but Paul talks about it's a kind of shame, it's a godly sorrow that leaves no regret. There's just a sense that I have crossed a line, I have done harm, I have sinned, wrongdoing has been committed, and it has a very, very easy solution. It doesn't leave regret. It moves us towards God, towards confession, and towards the other to make the repair and restoration if we let it do its work.
Could you give a quick example of something?
Yeah. So, no, I could give you plenty of, I'm going to give you an example from my own life, okay? So recently my husband and I were driving to an event, and I said something to him that came out of my mouth in a way that was just very critical. And I knew immediately, the minute it left my mouth, that those words and the tone caused harm. Now, he let me know that, which he's really good at in the healthiest of way, but I also knew in my conscience, because of the presence of the Holy Spirit, that happened. And so I was able to say to him, I am sorry. That was wrong, and be able to let him know that I saw how that impacted him. And then also privately be able to tell God, I'm sorry for that wrongdoing. And then it was done and over. It didn't affect the relationship with God or with him. We move forward.
You weren't hanging on to it from like the standpoint of like all night, like, oh, what a bad person I am.
No, that would be another type of shame that would linger. It's a great question.
No, that's good. So that's it. So I read it. I often, when I think of shame, like I think of shame as like all bad, like, and I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just from different things I've read, and so like to hear that, oh, there's actually some good shame or healthy shame. I wonder if it's also reframing that term for people in some light.
And that's why I really appreciate the book that Dan and Mel wrote, because it's just so clear in differentiating those. So there's moral shame.
So that's moral shame.
Yes. Okay. Then there's another type of shame that they identify that's called natural shame. And that's a shame that isn't involved with wrongdoing, but it's an experience that we have when we bump up against our limitations.
Okay.
So I don't know if everyone can see, but I have a boot on my
Yep.
foot. I broke my leg. Or, I'm
Right.
sorry, my foot last week.
Right.
And the reality is it has caused me some natural shame because it has made me realize within a 5-minute period of time that I am a limited person.
Right.
And I'm a very limited person right now.
Right.
There's not much I can do.
Yeah.
The people around me are doing the majority of the things that
Right.
I typically do for them or do
Right.
for the household.
Right.
And so there's an experience of, oh my, I'm a limited person and I need other people. It can also present itself when we bump up in a situation and we realize, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to think. I don't know how to perceive this. Like we recognize I'm not omniscient.
Right.
I'm not all powerful, and I'm not omnipresent either. Natural shame is necessary and healthy. And I think even before sin entered the world, there was natural shame
Yep.
by design.
Yep.
That it is too much of a burden
Yeah.
for us to be God.
Yeah.
We're creatures.
Yeah, it's interesting that you frame it in that way before sin entered the world, because I think partially why I think of shame, all shame is bad, because when Adam and Eve, sin, I think it says before they sinned, they were naked and knew no shame or something to that extent. I think that term.
A type of shame.
Yeah, a type of shame. Yeah. And so I just think, well, shame then entered the world and therefore shame is bad. But to hear it framed that way, moral shame, natural shame, I'm a limited person, those are things that, when we engage with them in a healthy way with God, steer us towards wholeness. Is what you're saying.
That's right.
Yeah.
And steer us towards acceptance, and they are very easily resolved. All shame, and this book also speaks to this beautifully, all shame to some degree causes a disconnection within ourself, with God, with the other. To some degree, all three of those things. But with moral shame and with natural shame, the path for resolution is just an easier path if we don't fight it and let it work for us.
Great.
Or let it work for us, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah. So then it sounds like there's still yet another type of shame.
Yes. And this is the type of shame that I think a lot of other authors, and I'm also going to say influencers, have addressed.
Yeah.
And what Dan Green and Mel Lorenz define it as is imposed shame. Other authors would call it like a toxic shame, okay? But what this is always, as they call it, a deceiver. It's a shame that comes from outside of us. It can be imposed on us, and oftentimes in very subtle ways. But then the other thing is, very, very quickly, we begin to take that message and impose it on ourselves, and sometimes even on other people. So, for instance, okay, let's just use this is a little bit jumping the gun, maybe just a little bit, but this is also how shame, the types of shame, interact. So again, you asked me in the car, so you weren't thinking about the harm that you had done and what a terrible wife you were when you went to bed.
Right.
No, because that's because imposed shame or toxic shame was not present.
Right.
When I broke my foot, I really didn't ever have the thought, what a klutz, or you're letting people down.
Right.
Like you should be able to just power through this.
Right.
If that was the case, that would be imposed shame kind of lurking around the corner.
Right. Yep.
Now, the thing, though, that I think most people can relate to are what we would call the subtle messages in words, tone, and behavior from, I'm just going to say, the systems that we have grown up in or that have shaped us.
Yeah.
Those can be family systems, church systems, sometimes school systems, and I'm going to say the American system has a tremendous amount of imposed shame.
Why would you
that it gives?
Yeah, so maybe You said family system,
Yep.
maybe church system. So maybe just give examples of those.
So in family systems, it can be a parent who through words, action, tone, and look give the message, you're a disappointment. You're not measuring up. You are not enough. Certain systems that schools are related to could do the same thing. Churches can do this as well. Sometimes I think this is even more subtle. Even the things that we don't talk about in churches can be a type of imposed shame because this is too bad.
Right. So bad we're not even going to bring it up.
Correct.
We're not even going to say the word.
Correct. So those would be some examples of that. In our culture in the United States, and again, I wouldn't want to live anywhere else than the United States, all right? But I also think all of us need to look with a discerning eye at our culture. It would be the same if you were in any other culture. But there are clear winners and losers in American culture. And people who are strong, people who are healthy, people who are powerful, and people who are wealthy. It's very clear they are the winners. Okay? But people who are weak, frail, oftentimes can't produce, whatever the case may be, there are subtle and not so subtle messages about how our culture looks at people like that and treats people like that. So that's an example of our systems and the people in them play a very powerful role in imposed shame.
That's really helpful. And I think that gives probably a more full picture of shame than I again, tend to think of it or even have ever thought of it. So what would you say is like the impact of shame? Like, so you have these different types of shame. What is the impact of, and I don't know if you want to address it from each one of these or keep going along the lines of imposed shame, because I'm going to guess that most people like me, when they think of shame and they think of the battle they feel with shame, whether they can put words to it or not, are probably wrestling with that imposed shame more so than the first two.
Absolutely. And I think we'll just talk about that one.
Great. So how do you see that impacting individual stories? You kind of alluded to it earlier in that it can rewrite somebody's story. So say a little bit more about that and how it can play out in somebody's life.
So when it rewrites the story, that kind of shame basically gives the message that I am defective. If it had one message to give, I am defective. I am disqualified. I should be cut off. I mean, all kinds of things like that. But the message that I am defective, inherently defective, and don't get me wrong, I mean, I know we all have our fallenness to contend with, but this is a very, very different, very, very different message. So the way that I see it play out are really in three different ways. So keep in mind that this changes the way someone perceives him or herself, the other, God, and the world. But what I notice the most as a therapist, but also somebody who has recovered from an imposed shame-based lens, is what kind of behaviors come out of this. And now this is anecdotal on my part. Okay, I want to make that very, very clear. But I have seen this in three categories. One would be what I call the overs. So people who have this sense of I'm defective, I'm never enough, they are over apologizing, they are over communicating, they are over explaining, they are over connecting, they are over achieving. All the overs.
Interesting.
And it's like it's just a never ending. It's just a never ending.
They're over the
quest.
top.
It's over the top all the time. All the overs. Then there are behaviors that would be what I call the unders. So sometimes people who feel like I'm always defective, I'm never going to measure up, I'm always going to disappoint so and so. They'll oftentimes underachieve. But what I've seen more than anything else is that they stay invisible. There's quite a bit of anxiety and fear about taking risks, in particular risks of vulnerability.
Yeah.
Or risks of trying something because the terror, not just fear, the terror of failure is just too high for them. So sometimes this plays out in the overs, sometimes in the unders. And then there's a third category of behavior.
Can I ask a question
You sure can.
about the unders? So do you think the under is so paralyzed by the fear of failure or whatever that they're afraid like, well, I'm going to fail, and that will only reinforce whatever narrative I have about the shame in my life?
Yep, that's part of it. And also, if somebody is living the storyline and believing the storyline, I'm defective, and there is something inherently unworthy, unlikable, unlovable about me, why in the world would they ever take the risk of quote unquote showing up at the table?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll be a burden. I'm stupid. People aren't interested. So that's a little bit more nuanced way of saying that.
Got it.
And then there's also a third category of behaviors, and I think this is really hard for people to wrap their head around because of how we experience individuals like this. I think when people are bullies, sometimes very arrogant bullies, very critical, sometimes even manipulators, many, many times behind that is unresolved, imposed, or toxic shame. And so the shame, what one is afraid of in him or herself, in particular, by way of what the imposed shame is telling them they are.
Yeah.
Okay? Gets kind of seen in the other person. Or the bullying that imposed shame takes within that person is exhibited in bullying behaviors externally. Now, I'm painting with very broad strokes, and certainly there are exceptions to this. But the reason people struggle with this when I put this on the table is that they think you're excusing behavior. Because we tend to look at people who struggle with this type of shame as very, very fragile, right? And to some degree that might be true, but to other degrees it's not. So we're not making excuses for behavior. But let me put it to you this way. This kind of shame that we're talking about, in my book, is like a quickly metastasizing cancer that will destroy the healthy, spiritual, psychological, relational cells in an individual, but then also can spread to other people and other relationships.
Yep. So are you saying people might say, hey, you're excusing behavior because you're not really like, so let's say for a bully or a manipulator, you're saying like, hey, there's this thing underneath, so we need to really like get after that, whatever that imposed shame is, to change whether the bullying tendency or the manipulating tendency. And by doing that, you're excusing this exterior behavior.
That's oftentimes what people's first reaction will be.
Yeah. So, and how would you try and give a little, I mean, I think you are, but give a little bit more on like how you would try and reframe that to say, sure, but like there's this thing that, how would you respond to that objection of excusing behavior?
Well, I'm going to borrow Father Richard Rohr's profound statement that wounds that aren't healed are transmitted.
Yeah.
And I think that's the best language I've ever heard. Wounds that are not healed are transmitted. So an unhealed wound will turn out to be wounding behavior towards the other person. I think that's how we hold the tension. That there's still accountability, but there's also understanding now that all behavior exists in a context. So
you got to wonder then, somebody who is a healthy individual, maybe who has dealt with their own shame, can then have capacity to enter into somebody else's life that has not dealt with their shame, and it's exhibiting itself as, whatever sort of unhealthy behavior.
Correct.
In a way to, I don't know, sit with them, guide them to the reality of like, hey, I can hold you accountable. That's not okay. But also have compassion for them to say there's something driving that. Like
Yes.
there's something driving that behavior. And maybe I can be present with them in a way to help hold space, if you will, for them to deal with that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the way that you're kind of framing that, it's, the idea that somebody could actually be freed from or heal whatever shame they carry, this imposed shame. I'm thinking like, okay, somebody who, you go back to a family system, and somebody who was in a family system that in whatever way, shape, or form, maybe it was like the older sibling got straight A's, and you were living in the BC category and didn't always get the straight A, and you always heard the mom or dad say, oh, why can't you be like your older brother or sister, right? So like they carry that with them. Like what do they do to take steps of like healing and being free from that shame?
Yes. Okay. So this is also what I've been taught, both from the book that I mentioned and also from people who've cared for and mentored me. If all shame to some degree is about disconnection, then the antidote is reconnection.
Yeah. So let's dig into that. That's interesting. When you say all shame is about disconnection, say more about that.
Okay. So let's just use the easy one, moral shame.
Okay.
When I have moral shame, I'm going to go back to the situation in the car. I recognize in that moment before it's resolved, there is a disconnection between my husband and I, and there's also a disconnection between God and I. And also, quite honestly, a disconnection from Jenny to Jenny.
Right.
Because this is not the way I want to show up.
Right.
There's an incongruency there. So there's disconnection there. With imposed shame, there's a disconnection, again, with self to self. I don't know who I am. I'm trying to follow the bouncing ball, who this other person, or at least who I think, what they're saying I should be, what they're insinuating I should be, or what I'm perceiving they think I should be. But I'm not able to pay attention to what is this self and the Holy Spirit residing in this self directing me to be. So there's a disconnection there. And then that very, very easily also creates a disconnection between self and God, because there's so much competition for who am I listening to. So that's kind of an example of how that works.
Yeah. So at the core of it, all shame, regardless of the type of shame, leads people to disconnection.
Correct.
Okay.
We are meant to be integrated.
Right.
We're meant to be integrated kind of at one time within the self, with the other, and with God.
Yep.
And shame disrupts all of that.
Yep.
So the antidote is reconnection. Okay.
Yep. So how do you pursue that? Like what is it? What does that look like? And again, I can see from the car example and the comment and like, okay, so the reconnection is the apology, is forgiveness granted, and like you have relationship repair, and then you move on with the rest of your night. You go to bed that night and you sleep soundly because there isn't anything hanging over your head. So somebody who's carrying shame from a family system or even a church system that's from, years ago and it's still with them, like what is reconnection look like for them?
So I'm going to give you the model that my therapist has given to me. Okay. She said, the reality is you have to be able to reconnect at 3 different levels. And sometimes not all 3 are available to you, but there are 3 that are available: self to self, self to the other, and self to God.
Self to the other. Got it.
Yeah. Now, there's no particular order to that. And like I said, sometimes we can't reconnect with the self. Like we don't know how to do that.
Right.
Maybe there isn't the other to connect connect to. So we have to find another appropriate other to do that. Okay. But though that's how we get reintegrated. Now, the one thing I want to say before we move forward, because if it's okay, I'd like to give a little exercise for people.
Sure.
Because there is an exercise that I think is really effective. But before I say that, I also want to say that for people who have experienced abuse and neglect, it might be a little bit too much and too terrifying to do alone what I'm going to suggest. Okay? And so that's why I think always, always, always having a safe other to help guide and help the process of putting us back together, it's just crucial.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's too overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I've made the mistake early in my therapeutic career of giving people this exercise without realizing there's too much disintegration because of the trauma and abuse, and they just feel like failures.
Yeah.
So I, unwittingly, have imposed shame by giving them an exercise that, in fact, it is too much for them to do.
Right.
Okay. So here's the exercise. So for the self, it's very important that a person is able to quiet themselves down and go to where the shame is located in your body.
Okay.
And I think people carry that different places. A lot of people will say it's in my gut or it's smack dab in the middle of like where my heart is.
Yeah.
Okay? And you have to be able to kind of keep it a little bit at a distance, but you're looking at it. Because when we can internally identify, that shame, we begin to become a little bit more familiar with how it shows up and what it feels like. And with more awareness comes more ability to not automatically default to where it's trying to take us. One thing that I will do with the little imposed shame people in me that kind of show up from time to time is I'll say, listen, I see you and I hear you and I know why you're there. But I need you to kind of go in the other room today and keep yourself occupied so I can carry forward with my day.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of that kind of an exercise.
So you're talking to yourself. You're talking to this
self-dialogue.
Shame. Yeah. Talking to your shame. Like you're personifying it almost.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. But self-awareness, being able to actually identify the experience of shame, when it's happening, what it feels like, where it's located, is so helpful.
Yeah.
To be able to stay what we call differentiated from it and not go with it when it shows up.
So I can see how maybe somebody could do that by themselves and that you're having a dialogue. What would it look like for somebody to do that not by themselves, with somebody else? Yeah.
Well, I think the most important thing is that there is something so powerful. Shame does not like to be exposed.
Yeah.
And so when you are telling somebody out loud what that internal experience is and where you're all tangled up, the shame will also lose a lot of its steam.
Yeah, it loses its power.
Yeah. And I also, too, think I'm such a believer in educating people, which is why I'm so appreciative of this book and others like it. Because I think when we actually have language for what's happening, and we also realize, wow, I'm not the only one.
Yep.
I mean, that's a shame buster right there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So what would you say is the effect? I mean, you've kind of alluded to it already, how shame can kind of manifest itself in different people's lives. But if it goes unaddressed, if we just live with it and we just accept it and normalize it in our lives, what is the effect of that in someone's life, and specifically the development of their own story?
Yeah, well, it's not just the development of their own story. I think it's more that they're never going to live into the story that is for every human being.
Yeah.
And so it results in a very diminished and disconnected life. And I don't think when shame is running rampant like that, we can't really fulfill the purpose and the call that God has for every human being.
Yeah.
Because the shame will interfere every time. I think it's very significant that one of the names for Satan is the accuser.
Right. Yep.
And I also think it's very significant, and by the way, this is a great way also for people to heal, is to watch Jesus in the Gospels with people that were considered the worst of the worst, that carried a lot of shame, and to be able to watch picture his face, his words, his tone. It's love, it's grace. I see you, I know you, I love you, and I know all about you, and I'm still here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I lost my train of thought with your question.
It's okay. Yeah. So the idea being like, what's the development of shame?
Yes.
Like if shame goes unaddressed in somebody's life,
Yes.
right? Kind of what could that look like? Where could it take them if they don't deal with their shame?
Yeah, a really diminished and disconnected life.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, the reality is, and again, I'm going to be honest, as a recovering person in this arena, it also makes the life of those we love really difficult.
Right. They may not want to be around us as much.
Well, it's hard. It's very hard. It's very hard.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the questions that I had prepared was this idea: can anybody live free of shame? And to kind of partially answer my own question, I'm going to guess you're going to say no, from the standpoint of like, when you view shame, moral shame, what was the second one?
Natural shame.
Natural shame. When you realize what those are and how they are used, maybe by godly design for our own benefit, those are very much always going to be with us.
And they need to be, those need to be with us until the new heavens and the new earth.
Right.
Okay?
Yep.
And also, regarding imposed shame or toxic shame, whatever language, a person wants to use, I don't know that we can ever be free from it, but I definitely think we can be freer.
Yeah.
And the goal would be, and I learned this from a colleague of mine too, that it would show up less frequently and with less intensity.
Yeah.
And that we'd be able to resolve it much quicker.
Yeah.
And I think that's realistic.
Yeah. So if somebody is listening to this episode and they just feel like, I am in a shame spiral 7 out of 7 days of the week, and I'm just feeling like I'm drowning in it, how would you encourage them in terms of like in this moment to like, okay, here's some words of encouragement on how to move beyond that place and find freedom?
Yeah. So the very first thing I would say is, if you can, pause or try to set the shame aside. It's not going to go away.
Right.
But to leave an open space that there might be a different storyline here. That'd be the first, is just at least some acknowledgement that maybe, I might not believe it, but maybe I would be open to the idea. That's it. Open to the idea that there might be a different storyline. But then the second thing is, get help. And I know that's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular podcast, but I think it's worth mentioning that I do think for people who have untreated depression and anxiety, sometimes that in and of itself just makes the antennas for shame so much more
Why is that?
attuned. Because the brain is very weary and depressed, or it's very wired and anxious. And so it's not judging things, perceiving things accurately. And I also think the centers of the brain then that regulate mood, they're just off. And so that can make a person much more susceptible to that experience of shame. Plus they're ashamed that they're depressed and anxious.
Right.
But I think getting help, telling somebody the story of your shame and where you're tangled up, and helping someone help you sort it through and find out where it has, what is it attached to and where it has roots. Right. One last thing, we don't talk about this often enough, I think, because it's I think it's, I want to say scary, but it's hard.
Yeah.
When Jesus talks about loving him, I'll just put it in a broad category. more than mother, father, brother,
Yeah.
sister. I often wonder if he also had this in mind. Because ultimately, we do have a decision to make. Whose marching orders am I going to follow?
Yeah.
Am I going to follow it of the imposers, whether they be in family of origin,
Right.
other systems, the culture, or am I going to follow the voice of the shepherd?
Yeah.
So I think the resolution of shame is very much part and parcel of the obedience of our discipleship. And for me, that was a game changer. I'm not
Yeah.
saying it has to be a game changer for anyone else, but
Right.
but whose voice am I
Totally.
going to listen to?
Yeah. 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 I'm thinking of John 10, right? The sheep, I call my sheep by name. They follow me. They know my voice. And like you said prior, one of the names for Satan is the accuser. And so that's always going to be that accusatory voice in our head is probably, we could say with almost 100% certainty, is not the Lord. That's not God's voice.
Right.
There's words
Right.
of correction, but that's different than words of accusation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And again, if someone grew up in a church system where God was
Yeah. Or that's how he's
painted
framed. Yeah.
as a very angry God who's always watching out for every little thing we do, that can be a hard turnaround.
Yeah.
But I believe at the core of my being, and I've seen it, that is the best thing about doing the work I get to do.
Yeah.
It's not just doing the work, it's actually watching the transformation that can happen for people. But God is very committed
Yeah.
to bringing us along in this. And then one final thing I want to say too is that we can't compare our growth in this or our healing in this to any other person. We have to start with where we're at. And God is just, I keep thinking about the potter at the wheel, the picture in the Old Testament. God knows the raw material that he's working with.
Yep.
And how he's going to work with us in this, how he's going to work with me is going to be different than how he works with you. There might be some general principles, but the reality is we just kind of have to put ourselves on the wheel
Yeah.
and let God start to get his
Yeah.
hands on us and start to do the shaping and the reshaping.
Yeah. Yeah. So you might have said, this would be my last question, this idea of like, you've got to do the work, right? That I don't know if you would say that's a counseling phrase or some sort of development phrase, but like, we've got to do the work. And this isn't something that just happens to us.
Correct.
Right? Like we have to be intentional
Yep.
in reframing, re-narrating, rewriting our story and inviting God into it and inviting other voices like counselors, therapists, trusted advisors, and how would you just characterize what that work is?
Well, I think it's twofold. And one is, and I appreciate the language of the 12-step programs on this one.
Yeah.
Because the 12-step programs will invite people, could you be open and willing
Yeah.
as your action step?
Yeah.
And so I think if people can just be open and willing, even
Could you
if
even imagine?
could you even imagine, or would you be willing
Yep.
to imagine?
Yep.
Open and willing to what God might have for you and what the journey
Yep.
might be. I think that is an action step.
Yeah.
Okay. I think the second thing would be, though, is that when we get new information that counteracts the narrative, that we start to integrate it, digest it, use it, put it into practice right away. I just think that's crucial.
Could you give an example?
So, for instance, when my therapist was working with me on this, and she said, when you're experiencing this shame, I'd like you to pick out ways. How are you going to connect with God? How are you going to connect with yourself? And who is the other you're going to connect with? Well, I had to pick that out and those means and actually start doing it.
Yeah.
That exercise that I walked us through, okay? That would require some discipline once a day with a journal or not, it doesn't matter.
Yep.
To have some solitude and go inward with the Holy Spirit
Yeah.
and take a look at that. And then I also think ultimately there are some decisions we need to make, about boundary setting, about whose voice are we going to listen, or marching orders are we going to, follow. there's some decision there. But again, sometimes it's more like, okay, God, I'm willing to have you bring this to me.
Yep.
I don't exactly know how to do it.
Yep.
But if you're open and willing, that's a start.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. This has been a really great conversation. And I just want to say for everybody who's tuning in that, I think sometimes people have this perception of like, oh, counseling would be great. It'd be great to go to counseling. I don't know where to go. Can I even afford it? I think there's that perception too, that it's like, I can't afford it. So over the course of these episodes, I'm going to continually remind our congregation, not that I'm a therapist, but come and talk to us and we'll help you find a therapist.
Great.
We have people, we have resources, and we can help cover some of the costs for it for people, because we really do want to see people get help. We want to see people experience the freedom that God has for them, whether it's freedom from grief, like we've talked about in another episode, or freedom from shame. And, this whole storytellers thing came out of Psalm 107, verse 2, that says, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Our assumption is that God is wanting to redeem your life, whether it's from shame or any other ailment that, you're finding sin bringing your way. And so just want to keep putting that as an encouragement to our congregation, that we will help you get the help you need and even walk with you through it. So
wonderful.
Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Yeah, we really appreciate you. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Right back at you.
Yeah. All right. Until next time, you guys take care. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.